Good afternoon, dear guests and the friends of MURCIR. Welcome to our Wednesday talks. I'm Zuhal Mertuzuner, Director of Marmara University Research Center for International Relations and shortly MURCIR. Before we delve into our today's session, let me provide a brief introduction about our esteemed research center. MURCIR has been a pillar of academic excellence for the past 30 years. Thanks to the invaluable contribution of numerous prominent scholars in Turkish academia, it has not only witnessed but also actively contributed to the evolution of international relations since the end of the Cold War. We encourage you to follow our activities through social media accounts and our YouTube channel. Our research center aims to contribute to academic researches in the intersecting fields of political science and international relations and between social sciences in Turkey and abroad. And we are aiming to follow all the improvements in global scope. We organize conferences, panels, workshops, and we had some publications, and you may reach all of them through our website. And Wednesday talks are a major part of our activities to follow agenda of international relations. And by 2020, our talks started to be broadcast via YouTube and online platforms. And this is very valuable for us because it made us to, let's say, to contact much closer to international academic community, and also that made us accessible for many friends and, let's say, the researchers. Today, we have a very prominent guest speaker, Barrinha from University of Bath, UK. Welcome to our session. Before going to your presentation, dear Dr. Barrinha, I would like to present your short biography. We have a visual material to share with you. Yes, here. I suppose now you can see it. Actually, it's a very long biography, a very successful researcher we are planning to listen today. Shortly, Barrinha is a reader, associate professor in international relations. His main research interests include technology and international order, European security, European foreign policy, and international relations theory and security. His work has been published in journals such as Contemporary Security Policy, International Affairs, European Security, Hague Journal of Diplomacy, Mediterranean Politics, Third World Quarterly, Journal of Common Market Studies, and Journal of European Integration. He co-authored International Relations Now and Then from Routledge. In 2019, he was awarded the Best Article in Global Affairs Award for a co-authored piece with Thomas Renard on cyber diplomacy and the English School. He is a former chair of ISA section Science, Technology, and Art in International Relations between 2023-2025. And he was one of the founder and convener of the British International Studies Association European Security Working Group between 2016 and 2018. And UASES RN Intersect Technology, Security, Society Interplays in Europe 2017 and 2020. Thanks again accepting our invitation, and we are very happy to see in our Wednesday talks. And it's time to leave the floor to you. Thank you again accepting our invitation.
Hi, everyone, and Zuhal, thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Yeah, so today I'm just going to provide you with a brief overview of what is cyber diplomacy and what are where it comes from and what are the main trends in this field. I generally like to start this discussion by contextualizing why nowadays we talk about cyber diplomacy, and in a way that goes way back to at least the 80s when some changes in technological developments, but also in science fiction, have led to the introduction of the term cyberspace. So I generally start with these three initial provocations when I talk about cyber diplomacy. The first one is this idea that cyberspace didn't really exist before the 80s. Uh, the second one is that it didn't really matter before the 90s. And then finally, that it really only became a geopolitical priority in the last 20 years. Now, obviously, for those of you that are more aware of these technological developments, you could say that cyberspace has been around for a longer period of time. And by the way, by cyberspace, by cyberspace, we can adopt Shukri's definition of cyberspace as a hierarchical contingent systems that is composed of multiple layers that include physical foundations, the logical building blocks, the information content stored, transmitted and transformed, and finally the actors, the entities, and the users that participate or that are part of this network of networks. So cyberspace is this multi-layered universe, multi-layered artificial construction that dominates so much of our lives nowadays. But as I said, this was not always the case. And the reason why I said that cyberspace didn't exist before the 80s was not because the technology had not been developed. Some of the basic developments started back in the 40s, but the predecessor of what we today call the internet, ARPANET, was officially launched in 1969, and since then we had a couple of decades of development of standards, protocols, and other technological developments that sort of consolidated what we generally call nowadays the internet. But as I said, we didn't really talk about it as cyberspace. So cyberspace is a term that was coined by a science fiction author, William Gibson, first in a short novel, and then in a famous novel, in a short story, and then in a famous novel called Neuromancer, where it basically talks about cyberspace as this consensual hallucination. And if you have seen the film The Matrix, you'd understand this idea of almost we inhabiting this parallel universe, this virtual parallel universe. A lot of the imagery is based on the dark cities in Japan, and if you watch films like Blade Runner, for example, is you can see a lot of these neons and often raining, dark skies, huge skyscrapers. So all of this is part of this imaginary that sort of develops in particularly in the 80s around cyberspace as almost like a science fiction understanding, as a science fiction understanding of the term. Back then, there were no real cybersecurity or cyber space as policy terms. That was a progressive addition that really only got consolidated in the late 90s. Until then, people would use a different type of language, information security, network security, you name it. As I said, there's been quite a few cinematographic representations of this imaginary Tron or Blade Runner are good examples of this. Um, and so this is why I say that it didn't really matter. It didn't really exist until the 80s, because it's only in the 80s that the actual term cyberspace becomes a reality. Then, as we move to the 90s, these technological developments, digital technology starts to become more prominent, particularly in big institutions, businesses, universities, states. So the digital revolution starts to happen mostly in the 90s, and that has to do with the opening up of the network to commercial players. Particularly under the Clinton administration, the internet is basically privatized, and with that, there is this almost explosion, this boom of access that didn't exist just a few years previously. This obviously advances together with another technological development, which has to do with personal computers and the fact that personal computers become much more accessible to individual users. Until then, only if you worked in a corporation or for a government agency, you'd have access to a personal computer. When we get into the 90s, it becomes much more common. So there's greater accessibility of personal computers also meant that more people would have the possibility of accessing the internet. With this, services and businesses start seeing an opportunity here to sell their products, to streamline their operations, and so more and more you start seeing this e-commerce developing and flourishing online. Uh, this happens alongside the broader geopolitical dynamics with the end of the Cold War. The United States economic, social, and cultural hegemony, basically spreading global communications around the world, and so the broader context was pretty much ideal for the dissemination of this technology or this set of technologies. Obviously, you also start seeing some of the first major cyber attacks, particularly as we move towards the late 90s. Moonlight Maze, for example, being a good case of the Russian infiltration into multiple US networks to steal information. And so from then onward, we start seeing periodically large scale or high profile cyber attacks that progressively start shaping the way we understand cyberspace and particularly how we understand cyberspace as a geopolitical domain. But oh, sorry, just to show you the internet growth from in the late 90s, we when we get to 1995, we only had about 16 million internet users around the world. In 5 years, we go from 16 to 360, and within 5 years from there, we go from 361 million to over a billion users, and the growth has been almost exponential until at least 2022. It obviously hasn't grown as much from then onward, but the growth continues. So this to say that until 95, the number of internet users was very, very limited, and therefore that's also another reason why cyberspace was not considered to be such an important aspect of politics and society in general. But as I said, as we move towards the 90s, and particularly with the turn of the millennium, we start seeing more and more signs that cyberspace was becoming a geopolitical priority, and or at least that states were starting to gather interest into how they could use cyberspace for their own strategic purposes. And a few signs of this the in 2007, for example, in Estonia, we have what some people call the first cyber war, where the Estonian authorities decide to remove the statue of the Soviet soldier from central Tallinn to the outskirts, and this generated a wave of protests by the Russian-speaking community, and with it, a wave of cyber attacks against Estonian institutions, government, and business institutions, and also media, which led to multiple disruption across the country for almost a month. And at the time, in 2007, Estonia was already a very fairly advanced economy, a digital economy, and therefore the disruption was significant. Most importantly, though, is that it helped a lot of leaders worldwide to focus their minds on the threat that cyberspace could pose, or the threats that could emanate from cyberspace, and led to a lot of countries, a lot of actors to basically decide to take action, both in terms of their cyber defenses, but also progressively in terms of thinking strategically about what they want cyberspace, how they want to position themselves in cyberspace, and what cyberspace should be for. Another parallel development is the rise of big tech, and both with the creation of some of the largest social media corporations, such as Facebook, um, we start witnessing this new type of powerful actor taking the first steps, and with it, a lot of questions being asked about how to engage with these actors, what is the role of social media, and how we can make sort of how can we regulate. So basically, the emergence of big tech starts happening during this period. And then, more directly related to the issue of cyber diplomacy, states start writing strategies, both cybersecurity strategies, but also international strategies for cyberspace, such as the one that the United States presented in May 2011. And we'll be talking a bit more about that in a second. So why did cyberspace become a geopolitical reality? And I think there's three reasons, or two reasons, as one as the bottom two are sort of interrelated. The first one is that the technological developments that led to the internet and to the popularization of the internet have had a particular impact on the way states interact with each other and also perceive the broader geopolitical environment. So basically, cyberspace has become both a reason of concern and an opportunity for states. According to Milton Mueller, there's a number of reasons why states were or are still today under pressure from developments in cyberspace. And that's because there's some inherent features to the technology or to these technologies that go against the controlling impulses that many states have when it comes to information, right? So internet globalizes the scope of communication by default. It increases exponentially the capacity for information generation, duplication, storage. It distributes control. The logic is that it's a decentralized set of networks, so it doesn't have any core, and therefore it's much harder to control. Also, quite a lot of the institutions that run the internet, particularly the technical dimension of it, are not state led. So basically, when we talk about internet governance, we tend to talk about a multi-stakeholder model in which there's multiple organizations that are led by civil society, private actors, etc., that have very significant responsibilities in terms of how the internet is run on a day-to-day basis. ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, tends to be seen as a prominent example of this. And and finally, all of this put together, we can say that the internet has enabled or has enables to this day the development of new forms of transnational communication, collaboration, and organization, again outside state control. And so, in that sense, a lot of states have thought about how these technologies needed to be reined in to an extent, but also how they need to interact with other peers internationally in order to try to regulate these set of technologies. But then on the other side, there's also cyberspace has also been seen as an opportunity for states. So if we talk, for example, about cyber power, like Joseph Nye talks, and there's a lot of discussions that we could have about what is cyber power, to what extent it is a useful concept. But fundamentally, the issue here is how states can basically exert their authority, or even more important, try to promote their interests internationally through cyberspace. And as you can see in the table that Joseph Nye has published in 2010, we can talk about uh, uh, informational instruments and physical instruments that states use both inside and outside cyberspace to provoke an effect that ultimately leads to the achievement of their own, or the attempt to achieve their own interests. So basically, this to say that cyberspace has been a reason for concern, but also an opportunity for states to exert their authority and to try to achieve their interests internationally. But more broadly, this also happens at the same time as we start seeing the ascent of Asia and this broader shift towards what some authors call, a lot of authors call this post-liberal order. So, just in terms of the specific ascent of Asia, it's quite interesting to note how in 2022, already the majority of internet users around the world were based in Asia. There were more internet users in Asia than in the rest of the world put together. So basically, what we have is a set of technologies that has been mostly developed in the West, being used um, in which the majority of the users are now placed in Asia, in the East. And this has led to a lot of friction as well, because obviously some of these states think that the rules and procedures and the basis on which this technology works do not really correspond to their own values and interests. Um, so, as I said, this happens within this broader international transition away from the liberal order to the post-liberal order. I'm not going to spend much time here because I want to get to the cyber diplomacy aspect per se. But this just to say that this shift has affected cyberspace, and this is something I've argued with my colleague Thomas Renard before. It has shifted cyberspace in three main dimensions. Before getting there, an argument that we make, Thomas and I, is, and I think that's the key issue here, is whereas the cyberspace can be seen as a product of the liberal order, in the sense that it was mostly developed in Western institutions, particularly the United States, underpinned by Western values or liberal values, to be more precise. What we see is a contestation of these. These are examples of some of the founders of the founding figures of cyberspace and the internet. Um, Basically what we see is a contestation of some of these principles and rules. And what we argue is that this contestation happens at three levels: in terms of power, in terms of those values, and then in terms of the institutions that underpin cyber governance. Very briefly, in terms of power, this takes place at three levels, or there's three main dynamics to be more precise. One of the redefinition in terms of states having to now consider the cyber component when they are basically defining their role in the world. What are their cyber capabilities? How advanced are they? How do they compare? All these things. There's also a possibility of adjustment. So states that tend to punch above their weight in this domain, whereas before they were not as relevant, either because of size, lack of development in some sectors, etc., have become more important internationally because of the way in which they have engaged with cyberspace. So, for example, Estonia is a good example of this, a leading actor in this area, where it's not generally seen as a leading actor in other aspects, particularly of military defense or military security. And finally, we have the vertical challenge to power, in the sense that we have a lot of non-state actors, from private actors to hackers, that sort of challenge the state on a regular basis. And this vertical challenge is also something that states have to deal with. Then there's a contestation of values, both in terms of how cyberspace should be run, but also in terms of how some of the fundamental concepts that govern cyberspace, what they mean. So, for example, sovereignty is something that has been advocated. So we need more sovereignty in cyberspace. Also, we should have a more multilateral system in this regard. So less of the multi-stakeholder model that I talked about before, and more of states actually making the decisions and leading the organizations. This is an ongoing debate. It has been for the last few decades. But then finally, also, as I said, a contestation of what some terms mean, like democracy. What does it mean, democracy in cyberspace? For some states, democracy is about having civil society and other actors have their say in terms of cyberspace, how cyberspace should be run. Whereas for some other states like Russia, for example, or China, democracy in cyberspace basically means to have all states having a say in terms of how cyberspace should be run. And then all of this trickles down to the institutional level. And as I said, ICANN is seen as a fundamental example of this multi-stakeholder model. Um, and some of these states favor a more more state-centered model, and they do that by focusing on the ITU, but also on regional initiatives such as the Shanghai Cooperation versus the Budapest Convention, which was until recently the only major or the first major international treaty addressing an aspect of cybersecurity, which states, particularly authoritarian states, contest in terms of not only the process that led to it, but also fundamentally its content. So basically, with the post-liberal order of this shift towards a post-liberal order, we have the contestation of these three levels: power, values, and institutions. And if cyberspace can be seen as a product of the liberal order, cyber diplomacy is thus seen as a product of the post-liberal order. Cyber diplomacy has come to the fore so that states could engage with other states and other actors in this domain, as often happens in other domains of diplomacy. So what do we mean by cyber diplomacy? This is a definition that I've put forward together with my colleague Thomas Renard as basically the use of diplomatic resources and the performance of diplomatic functions to secure national interests with regard to cyberspace. And in that sense, cyber diplomacy is different from other uses of the word diplomacy associated with digital technology, such as digital diplomacy, which we tend to view mostly as a public policy through digital means. And we'll be talking a bit more about that later. Or e-diplomacy, that would basically be about the usage of digital technologies to improve work in embassies and consulates. For example, filling in visa forms online rather than having to do it in paper format. What is cyber diplomacy for? We argue that it has four main functions. At the most essential, to keep channels of communication open between states, obviously a fundamental task of diplomacy in general. Even when states are at war, diplomacy is there to keep channels of communication open, to foster bilateral and multilateral dialogue, particularly with partners in this domain. Third, to try to come up with some shared norms and standards at both regional and international levels. And we're going to be talking a bit more about that in a second. And finally, about promoting states' interests in this domain. So if cyberspace has only really become a geopolitical issue in the last 20 years, we can argue that the term cyber diplomacy is a conceptual, even more of a conceptual novelty, and it has had very limited policy and academic traction until the 2010s. And basically, a lot of the practice of cyber diplomacy happened, at least throughout the first decade, as we're going to see in a second, without necessarily being called cyber diplomacy. One of the first publications to actually address the issue of diplomacy in cyberspace was an East-West Institute report that specifically focused on the relations between Russia and the United States, and highlighting that in addition to the more militaristic understanding of cyberspace, that diplomacy should be also playing a role in the discussions between the two countries. In academic terms, however, the cyber diplomacy was still very, very much a niche concept, and even in major publications around diplomacy, such as the Oxford Handbook of Modern Diplomacy and the Sage Handbook of Diplomacy, the concept itself is only mentioned once in each one of these volumes, and it's basically talking about cyber and digital and e-diplomacy as basically broadly referring to new forms of public diplomacy. So a fairly generic and largely inaccurate use of the term. To this day, since then, we could argue that there's been quite a lot of people working on in this area, and it is a burgeoning field. But to this day, there's only really two books with the title Cyber Diplomacy, and that would be Sean Riordan's from 2019 book called Cyber Diplomacy: Managing Security and Governance Online, and more recently, Alexandre Paulo's dissertation that turned into a book on cyber diplomacy in Brazil, so building bridges and cyber diplomacy. Um, as I said, this was a domain without a name for quite a while. In 1998, Russia proposed a treaty banning electronic and information weapons, and this sort of kick-started the process at the UN level that then in 2004 led to the first group of governmental experts. I don't have time to go into detail now about the GGs, but I'm happy to answer questions about it later on. But this was quite important in terms of the development of a responsible state behavior framework among states within the UN context. Also, during this period, we have the World Summit on Information Society in 2003 and then 2005, where we start witnessing quite a lot of friction between states and between those two main models of multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism being affirmed as a cause of division in the governance of this domain. So that first GG was the first, which sort of kick-started the whole process at the UN General Assembly level that had meant that we had multiple iterations of these GGs and then more recently the development of open-ended working groups. So just very briefly, the GGs were closed groups of experts nominated by states that had the responsibility to fundamentally discuss this issue about how ICTs affect international security and provide conclusions. But they were generally limited and across the 6 iterations between 15 and 25 members, whereas the OEWGs, the open-ended working groups, were open to and are open to the whole of the UN membership, and they are publicly accessible, so anyone can watch the sessions live. And then, in parallel to this, we also had the ad hoc committee on cybercrime that led to the treaty last year, and the process is now at the stage of signature and then ratification. And this is the first international treaty that is approved by all the UN membership to discuss to regulate issues around cybercrime. So in a article I published more recently, I talk about how cyberspace has basically been diplomatized, and so basically what I mean is that the issue has become more and more centered around ministries of foreign affairs and around professional diplomats, rather than what happened initially, where a lot of these discussions were left to technical experts or at most to intelligence or defense officials. And so we see this progress even within the GGE, where in the first ever GGE, we only had really 4 experts coming from the ministries of foreign affairs of the countries. And then when we get to the second GGE, we already had 7. And with each one of the GGEs, we see more and more of these people being the ones leading the discussions and the negotiations. When we get to the last GGE from 2019 to 21, we had 15 people that were not just coming from the MFAs, but they actually had cyber or equivalent in their title. So this clear push towards the professionalization of this domain and the diplomatization of this domain is very clear through looking at the GG membership. As I said earlier, so this is the international strategy for cyberspace, and this was quite important because it sort of consolidated the creation of the Office of the Coordinator for Cyber Issues within the US State Department, and it sort of was sort of not necessarily the first, but one of the first real examples of the institutionalization of cyber diplomacy, and it really opened the door for other states to follow through. And so they did. And so what we have seen is an exponential increase in the number of MFAs with offices or bureaus dedicated to cyber diplomacy since then. They have adopted very different models. Some have cyber ambassadors, others have cyber coordinators, others have the broader title of digital ambassadors. But fundamentally, there is an understanding that the issues around cyberspace need to have some form of diplomatic representation. Obviously, this raises quite a lot of interesting questions about the adequacy of the state or the adequacy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to deal with these novel issues. And there's a lot of questions to be asked here in that regard. I've already talked briefly about the US international strategy. Other states have followed through, not just developing cybersecurity strategies with an international component, but also by adopting legal positions in terms of how they perceive cyberspace and how they perceive their position within cyberspace on issues around interference, sovereignty, etc. And then finally, we obviously had a myriad of international processes, some regional, some international, some informal, some formal, which currently dominate a very wide and busy landscape when it comes to cyber diplomacy. So to conclude, a few main issues that I think are on the table today, and I would divide them between conceptual, institutional, and geopolitical. The conceptual one, it's twofold. One has to do with who actually can be a cyber diplomat. Cyberspace has, from the beginning, been a domain in which non-state actors have played a very prominent role. And what we have seen more and more is that these actors have an active interest in putting forward different perspectives on how cyberspace should be governed. And in some cases, they've actually hired former diplomats to represent them in these discussions. Microsoft tends to be seen as the most clear example of this, but it applies to other companies and other actors too. But the question here is, can a non-state actor be seen as a diplomat, or is diplomacy a function that is limited to the state? It's a fundamental institution of the international society, as Hadley Bull would call it. So I think this is an interesting debate to be had in terms of who gets to be a cyber diplomat. Then there is some confusion about what is cyber diplomacy and what is digital diplomacy. That confusion has sort of been with the field since the beginning, but now it assumes a different character. Why? Because what we are seeing is more and more technological related issues, particularly around digital technologies, to necessitate some form of international discussion and negotiation. So the European Union, that in 2015 was quite instrumental in consolidating the term cyber diplomacy by having its council conclusions and by creating this unit within the European External Action Service. 5 years later, also had some conclusions, but on digital diplomacy. And digital diplomacy for the EU is a very broad, covers a very broad range of activities and responsibilities, as you can see here in this set of paragraphs. And these came from the 2022 conclusions on digital diplomacy. As you can see, not only there are a lot of responsibilities here, but also there's a fair bit of overlap with the things that are generally seen as the responsibility of cyber diplomacy. So this is an ongoing issue that affects the European Union, but also the way in which cyber diplomacy is constantly being managed by different MFAs around the world. And when we look at some of the leaders in this area, we can see how there is often not a clear-cut distinction between what is cyber and what is digital. So in Denmark, for example, we have the Office of the Tech Ambassador that was created already a few years ago. The fundamental responsibility, or one of the main responsibilities here, was to directly interact with big tech companies, but also to interact with states around the world. It also included a portfolio around cybersecurity, but as you can see, it was called and is called the Office of the Tech Ambassador. In Australia, for example, we have the Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology. So basically, the two areas are together. In France, since quite a while now, we have the Ambassador for Digital Affairs, which is also responsible for cyber diplomacy. And then finally, in the United States, at least between 2022 and 25, because there's currently a proposal on the table by the Trump administration to again reorganize how the State Department deals with cyber diplomacy. But between 22 and 25, we had this merge between cyber and digital policy, and we had Daniel Fick as the first U.S. ambassador at large for this area. So basically, states are trying to navigate all these different technological challenges and how best to accommodate them institutionally. Still, also institutionally, but also geopolitically at the international level, we have a few ongoing problems or issues that are currently being discussed. One is what's the future of the discussions within the United Nations framework. The OEWG is coming to an end this year. There are alternatives on the table, but basically there is a lot of division in terms of what is the institutional future of cyber diplomacy within the United Nations. There is also a discussion that has been with us from at least 1998 about whether it is possible to have, or whether we should have a treaty on international cybersecurity. This is another cause for a significant division. Western states are against a treaty on international cybersecurity. They say we have enough norms and we have acknowledged that international law applies to cyberspace as to any other domain, and so we do not need a specific treaty. A lot of other countries are of the opinion that we do. The third issue is that what I just mentioned, we have this increased overlap with other digital policy issues, and so this affects not only the way different ministries organize themselves internally, but also how this will then structure international discussions around these issues. How do you differentiate discussions about cybersecurity from discussions about artificial intelligence, for example? But again, we can't have one discussion about everything because there's so many things to cover. As we speak, all of these things are also being impacted by continuous technological development, AI, quantum computing. So these technological developments will bring an additional pressure and additional questions to how we deal with these issues. And finally, we have these other ongoing dynamics of deglobalization, the assertions of digital sovereignty, the fear of a splinter net, the internet breaking up along different jurisdictions. Are we moving towards that? How can diplomats deal with these dynamics, and what are fundamentally the consequences, not just for the international system, but for us users as well? So to conclude, three basic points. First, cyber diplomacy is the result of an increasingly contested international system. It comes because cyberspace becomes a geopolitical issue that needs to be negotiated, discussed, and states have to have or see their interests asserted in the international domain. Second, the importance of terminology. What does it mean when we talk about cyber diplomacy? What are the conceptual and institutional consequences of adopting the term or other terms such as digital diplomacy, as we seem to be doing at the moment? So this terminological discussion is also ongoing, and I think it will be quite important to follow it. And finally, as I just said in the previous slide, all of this happens at the same time as we're seeing very significant technological changes. And how are we going to adjust to these new technologies? And are we going to ensure that they fit within whatever framework we agree as an international society? And I would probably end here. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take on any questions.
Thank you. It is very interesting and very comprehensive presentation. Actually, for me, who is not so much, let's say, was not interested in this issue, but now I think it's very interesting and very. I'm now so eager to read more about these things because it's obvious that we have to face with this issue more. Actually, I have so many things in my mind to ask, but when I'm planning to ask a question, you were answering in the following slide. So I hope I can manage to find a meaningful question to you because it was really well organized presentation for even the person who is not so familiar about this issue. But when I was listening, first thing was very interesting for me, the space definition, because the space is very important. And in this space, in the world, we were talking about sharing and we were talking about power, security, relative position of different actors and actorship, who are actors, who are not. So it's directly related with the essence of politics, I think. Huh? So we are discussing in this the polycracy atmosphere, and it was not only related with crisis, it was related with feeling of losing control. Am I wrong? So we were so much used to control everything with several very well settled institutions. So it was relatively easier to control it. And at the end of the Cold War, it started to be a little bit more complicated. But with emergence of this alternative space, things were a kind of, let's say, nightmare for these people who are used to live with a settled, very well-defined borders and institutions. That's why actually we are trying to follow and understand what's happening to politics, what's happening to people's life. I remember this book I was trying to read. Maybe you know this too. This is from Varoufakis, Yanis Varoufakis, Techno-Feudalism. He was talking about space and the new space, new politics. So I think the last of your presentation, there was a discussion about is the digital diplomacy or cyber diplomacy. So maybe it's time to discuss about the cyber issue by starting from the beginning, the space discussion. So why I'm talking about these things? Because now we are trying to understand foreign policies of states and what kind of actors are they, and what is changing in politics generally. And we see rise of authoritarianism, changing tendencies in values. What are these values? So what kind of world is this post-liberal world? So all they are very much interrelated. And when I was thinking about this, your argumentations about this diplomacy, new space of diplomacy, first I thought, what is the existing relative position and relative power, or let's say the capability positions of the existing states about this cyber space, cyber diplomacy. And then I thought, what can be the position of Turkey in this, let's say, the situation? Because we are talking about a new decision-making system. So foreign policy is not anymore so much coming from the professional ambassadors, and there are need to have much faster decisions. So things are changing, and maybe the first question will be about relative position of states and what kind of, let's say, the positioning you can make for the states' capacities. And secondly, what kind of changes happen to decision-making mechanism together with this cyber diplomacy. So I understand it needs a very high level of flexibility, agility to adapt as soon as possible to all these developments. I hope I'm enough clear to ask my question, because it's also not so easy for me to explain in this mass what I have in my mind.
Thank you. No, I think they're very good questions. I think the answers, I mean, we could stay here for a very long time discussing just these 2 points. In terms of the relative position of states, generally speaking, there are three main groups around these issues. So you tend to have what's called the Western and like-minded states that tend to advocate for a free and open internet, and an active role for civil society, et cetera, et cetera. So, basically advocates of sort of like a liberal position. And these tend to be the European Union, the United States and Canada, and then also South Korea, Japan, for example. So those tend to generally be the advocates of these positions. Also, obviously, they, particularly the United States, are in a particular advantageous position in the sense that they have a lot of the big companies in this area are based in the United States, and also they were the ones to an extent setting the standards and the norms that govern the technical aspects of the internet. And so in that sense, they they tend to have a more defensive position in this area, right? Because they tend to have the status quo. Then on the other side of the aisle, you tend to have the what we could call, broadly speaking, the authoritarian group. So this is generally led by Russia and China, and it has a few other states that tend to side with them on a regular basis. Countries like Iran, Cuba, those would be two, for example, Syria, until at least the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Those countries have traditionally sided with this group, and they are clear in advocating a much more state-controlled cyberspace. They think that there's too much there's there's a lack of control in terms of how information flows, and there's too much power in the hands of non-state actors. And then you have the majority of states in the international system that tend to oscillate between these two groups. And uh, it depends often on the issue at hand. It also depends on short-term alliances and partnerships. But some of the literature calls these groups, these states, the swing states. And this is particularly the case with medium powers of the international system: India, South Africa, Brazil, and to an extent Turkey as well would be, I think, part of this group. So these are states that, as I said, traditionally they tend to go with one side or the other, depending on the concrete discussion or on the concrete issue. What we have been witnessing in the last few years is quite a lot of these states have been developing a more articulate position in terms of affirming their own interests. They're not simply followers, but they actually have their own agenda, and they actually have their own specific ambitions. And so I think this is a sort of a new phase, or a recent phase in cyber diplomacy, where we see some level of maturity by these states that did not used to be so active in this domain. And then we could say we have a fourth group, which is smaller and smaller, which is the group of states that still doesn't see how a lot of these discussions benefit them or are related to their own national priorities. And so states that don't even have anyone specifically appointed to follow these issues, or they don't have the capacity to do so. These also tend to be those that are least developed, and definitely from a digital perspective, uh, they are on the on the far side of the digital divide. But they are, as I said, fewer and fewer, because I think states, including the global south, they have acknowledged the importance of these issues. They're starting to understand better and better that these are not simply discussions for the superpowers of the international system or the great powers of the international system. These are issues that affect them as well directly. In terms of your second question, just another point on the relative position. So something that is quite interesting about these discussions is how Russia has actually had a lot of influence in terms of the evolution of the debate. So it was Russia that proposed the first resolution in '98. It was Russia that proposed the creation of the GGEs. It was Russia who proposed the creation of the Open Networking Group, and it was also Russia initiative the creation of the Convention on Cybercrime. So uh, for all its flaws, and we could talk a lot about Russia's position, but they have had a lot of initiative in this domain, which is, from an international relations perspective, quite interesting. And so going on to moving to the second question, which is about changes to decision-making mechanisms and how fast states need to adjust. I think that is a significant problem, and I would say um, there's two dynamics here. On the one hand, we have the use of the traditional mechanisms to try to address these issues, and as we know, they are slow. Sorry. A lot of the discussions that we are having nowadays in the United Nations, for example, we've been having those discussions for the last 20 years, right? And in order to achieve something it takes months and months of discussion. And the problem there is that traditional diplomacy does not follow. Sorry, I need to. The problem there is that traditional diplomacy does not is not in line with the speed of technological developments. And so that is a problem. The other solution that states have found is to, and this is also a broader trend in international relations, is the progressive informalization of international relations and discussions that take place in ad hoc forums or agreements that are ad hoc or that bring in different stakeholders. So things that are able to move faster is also part of the response. But this is at the international level. At the national level, I think it's quite interesting to see how different states basically try to adjust these new challenges to preset structures, right? And and then how those preset structures often enable or prevent states from being more active in this domain. So states where, for example, there's greater movement of people across ministries tend to be more able to uh, be more influential, tend to be more influential in this domain because they're able to adjust, they're able to increase staff temporarily, they're able to do things that states that are heavier are not able to do, right? So it is quite fascinating when you talk to people from different countries to see how this happens in practice. And I think there will be a time in which we need to reconsider seriously how a lot of the ministries of foreign affairs work around the world. They were developed, as I said earlier, for a different world, right? And the fact that um, you still see a lot of rotation among diplomats, that people can be cyber diplomats for 2 years and then move on to become ambassadors in another country, which was generally seen as a positive thing because diplomats would be generalists, and so they would have this very broad understanding of the world, and they would not commit themselves to one specific domain. Um, this, to an extent, is not very adequate for a world in in which you are supposed to have a bit more of an expert knowledge in some areas, right? If you want to have discussions with big tech companies or states that have a much larger delegations discussing or responsible for specific technology related issues, you need to have that knowledge if you don't have those resources. And so having that rotation system can, in that sense, be a challenge for some states, particularly those that, as I said, that are not those with the most resources.
Okay, thank you. It was very satisfactory session for me. Thanks for your contribution. It was wonderful. Um, I hope to host you in person in our faculty in the next year because I suppose this topic will be in our agenda for more days. So it was wonderful, and I want to congratulate also for your awards. It is obvious that it is well-deserved award for these valuable studies. Thanks again, and hope to see you again in our activities.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was my pleasure.
Nice
Have a good day.
and have a nice day. Bye bye.
Bye.